Parents, the following program is intended for people over the age of 13. If your kids are younger than that, please use the YouTube Kids app.
Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Peter Bernard's Scary Stories for Adults.
Welcome to the Scary Stories NYC Ides of March or shortly thereafter stay-at-home super long 2-hour special. I'm Henry Lee Dogman, and now I'd like to bring out my co-host, your old pal Bigfoot. Thank you, Henry. As you can see, the management has sent us all to work from home. I'm here in my secret basement apartment, and Henry is where he lives, in the middle of nowhere. Don't knock it till you've tried it. The rent is very affordable. How long do you think they'll make us work from home anyway? I don't know. Probably at least till sports ball starts up again. At least they didn't cancel Dr. Death's St. Patrick's Day episode. That still happens here tomorrow, God willing. Oh, good. I'm a big fan of PQ River. Sure, we all are. So, do you want to start this thing, or should I begin? Why don't you go first? Sounds good. I have a bunch of stories to tell today. I think between all of us, we have 18 stories coming up in this episode. So if you're working at home and you need a scariness break, we've got over 2 hours of Dogman stories to tell you. Before we get started with the first story, let me take a second to point out that today's executive producer is Arlene Freiberg, or Freeberg. I think that's how you pronounce it anyway. Thank you, Arlene. We couldn't do it without you. If you'd like to become a Scary Stories executive producer like Arlene, just join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Once you join, we'll send you links within 24 hours to our growing collection of uncensored, scary Dogman and Bigfoot stories that are so wild, so gross, or so something that we're not even allowed to tell those stories on this channel. A brand new uncensored story each week, and you can join for as little as $7 a month? Well, okay, as low as $3 a month? Can't afford that? Okay, you can get all this for only $1.50, but that's as low as we can go. And now, let's get the show started. Here's a story that's kinda scary, but I admit it's not as scary as the stories that come after it. I still think it's a good place to start, because it's the strangest Dogman story I think I've ever heard. It supposedly only happened last April in 2019, and it's allegedly true. It has to do with one of the few subjects just as scary as Dogman: taxes. And the name of this one is Dogman Made My Taxes Late. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this story happened to me just last year around tax time. As usual, I left everything to the last minute and had to rush to fill out my forms on the final day. I ran to the mailbox in my neighborhood because I know what time Ted the mailman comes to collect what's there. We don't have a post office within walking distance, and my eyesight isn't good enough for me to have a driver's license. So that mailbox was and is my only snail mail option. Now, my friends informed me the day after this happened that I could have used an online tax service, and that some of them are free, so I guess that was a big goof on my part. If I were a little more up to date and with it, though, I never would have encountered the legendary Wisconsin Dogman. So, it was a misty night as I walked to the post office. My neighborhood is very tree-lined. Most of the houses are set back from the road and partially hidden in the trees, and there's a bit more distance between houses than usual. It feels like a walk through nature, even though you're actually traveling past all your neighbors. I reached the corner opposite to where the mailbox is and stopped. There appeared to be something very large next to the mailbox, and I was having trouble in the darkening sky making out exactly what I was seeing. It could have been a man hunched over, possibly, I thought, because of my eyes. When I go out at dusk or later, I usually bring a pretty high-powered flashlight with me. It's brighter than my cell phone flashlight, and it really has come in handy in this heavily forested neighborhood. So I shone my flashlight on whatever the dark mass was, and it ducked back behind the mailbox, keeping itself in shadow. The thing is, as it did so, it also reflected incredibly bright eye shine. So bright, it made me gasp. I had only seen eye shine like that from cats, and a cat that large would be too dangerous for me to go near. It would have to be, at the very least, a large mountain lion. I stayed where I was, resolving to try to wave Ted the mailman down when he came driving down the road. I looked at my watch, and I was very close to Ted's usual arrival time, unless he had come early, in which case I was screwed. I was turned away from the mailbox and whatever was hiding behind it to see if Ted's mail truck was coming down the road yet. From behind me, I heard a very hostile kind of growling sound. Turning around in fear, I kept my flashlight mainly pointed down toward the ground. I would use it if I had to, but first I wanted to see if I had to. The creature, whatever it was now leaning on the mailbox, with its two front legs resting on top comfortably, and its feet supporting it on the ground. Its ears looked more like a bear's ears than a cat's ears, and I wondered if that was what I was looking at. It was the size of a bear, and much larger than any cat which is supposed to live in the United States. Just then, the creature leaned its head back to look directly upward, and it howled. It howled like a dog, and I knew that was what it had to be. I shone my flashlight toward it, and as bad as my eyesight is, I can still tell you that it was a very large, black and white, salt and pepper dog, and it was standing on its hind legs, coming up to about twice the height of that mailbox. As this happened, I could hear old Ted coming up behind me, so I turned around and waved to him frantically, trying to get him to see me there. I looked up and saw him make eye contact with me and smile, then wave back. He didn't get why I was waving at him. He drove right past me and toward that mailbox. Once he started pulling off to the right by the mailbox and slowing down, that Dogman erupted out of the shadows and charged at Ted's mail truck. Ted hit the gas and sped out of there with the Dogman racing bipedally after him down the highway. I guess Dogman hates mailmen just as much as regular dogs do. I went and put my taxes in the mailbox, and I figured I had done my duty. But the thing I didn't think of was that Ted wasn't going to come back around to pick up that mail until the next morning. And so that is the story of how Dogman made my taxes late. Dogman ruined my fiance's pantsuit. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a story that happened to me when I was much younger, much richer, and engaged to be married to a lovely younger, richer person. Okay, it was actually only 3 years ago. I was driving to meet my fiancée out at her father's house in the country, where I was supposed to pick her up and drive her to some country club event or something. She told me where to find her, and as I pulled up to the location at the edge of her father's property, I saw her standing to the right. She was looking my way, seeming to be annoyed. The other thing that caught my eye, however, worried me far more than any expression on that girl's face, because what I saw, walking out of the woods to the left and heading straight toward my fiancée, was a big, hairy man, as big as a Bigfoot, taller than a linebacker. And the freakiest thing about this guy, the thing that set the adrenaline racing through me more than anything else, was that the guy had a wolf-shaped head. There was essentially a wolf man heading across the street toward my girlfriend, and I had to get between it and her in order to pick her up. I did just that, swerving the car in a total James Bond kind of a maneuver. The werewolf was still a bit to my left, but my screeching to a halt had splattered mud off the road up onto my fiancée's expensive new designer bell-bottoms. Rather than getting in, she was standing there, looking disgustedly at her dirty pants. I opened the door and shouted for her to get in the car, which she began to do slowly, as though she were doing me a favor. Instead of closing and locking her door, she lectured me about how I had just ruined her pants. The Dogman was sliding over the hood of my car like T.J. Hooker, heading toward her open door as she was ignoring him and lecturing me. The monster hit the ground, and I hit the gas, jerking my girlfriend uncomfortably around since she wasn't fully inside yet, but also saving her life in the process. We sped off, with the Dogman holding onto her door and her shouting abuses at me. I totally Steve McQueen'd it, racing that car as fast as I could take her and swerving back and forth, trying to throw off the monster dog, threatening the life of my intended bride. Finally, the Dogman flew off into a patch of bushes, and I could breathe a sigh of relief. I had just been through a traumatic moment. I felt like my heart was going to explode. At that point, I noticed that my fiancée was still talking. She had not shut up once about her pants and my rudeness. She hadn't been through any trauma at all. She seemed to not care at all how closely we both came to being torn apart by an apex predator. She was only concerned about how I needed to check my male privilege and validate her sense of outrage at my ruining her expensive pants. I decided against marriage that night. I gave her a check to replace the pantsuit, and I told her goodbye. I feel like I dodged a bullet. I could have ended up married to the most selfish narcissist on the planet, but it didn't happen because Dogman ruined my fiancée's pantsuit. Dogman ruined my perfect driving record. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was driving in Pennsylvania one night, and a Dogman ran out of nowhere and started chasing my car. I increased my speed, and he dropped to all fours, then started to gain on me. I floored it and ran my car as fast as it could possibly go. It started rattling like it was going to fall apart, but the Dogman started to recede into the rearview mirror. I was actually slowing back down to normal speed when I was pulled over by the highway patrol. Sometimes I wonder if Dogman is working for the cops. I explained to him that I had to speed to escape the Dogman, and I kept looking backward to see if he was still chasing me. The Dogman didn't appear, but the officer made me take a sobriety test, and that's how Dogman ruined my perfect driving record. Stalked by the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a very short story for you, but it's also very true. It happened when I was a teenager, and it happened in New Jersey. I was followed home the entire way from the library one night by the Dogman. I mean a kind of long-haired German Shepherd kind of a dog walking bipedally, sticking to the shadows. It was the most frightening experience of my life, and after I got home, I couldn't stop crying for literally over an hour. I was so grateful to be safe. I even hugged my annoying younger sister. I was so relieved to be home that it got my father unhappy. He gave me a lecture about how I shouldn't feel so comfortable in his home since I was almost 18 and I should be getting ready to move out. Even Dad acting like an ass made me cry with happiness because as long as he was grouching at me, that meant I was safe from being stalked by the Dogman. The Dogman at the railroad crossing. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I once met a Dogman totally randomly. It was while I was driving, and I came upon a railroad crossing that had just begun ringing and blocking traffic. I stopped my car and waited for the train to pull up and pass. As I did so, I noticed in my side rear view mirror that there was a strange figure approaching from the distance. What I saw was a dog walking bipedally. It was walking out of some trees, out onto the road, and toward my car. I had not been drinking or doing anything else that would make me hallucinate, and I saw a dog walking on its hind legs like a man toward my car. The train was going past loudly, and that dog-headed hairy monster was walking up toward me. I was praying for the train to go before the Dogman got there, but neither seemed to be in any kind of a rush. Finally, the train finished passing, and the creature was still coming, only about 20 or 25 feet away by then. But the train had passed, so now I could go, except I couldn't. Even after the train passes, the bar's down, blocking your passage for some time, for some kind of imaginary safety reason, I guess. I was fed up. I put the car in reverse, and I looked behind me so that I could aim better for that Dogman. I hit the gas, and I sped backward, directly at the creature. It easily evaded my attempt to hit it, then did something I should have been prepared for but was not. He grabbed a hold of my car, and as I put myself back into first gear, he held on for the ride. I saw that striped bar ridiculously still down, heard the stupid bell ridiculously still ringing. I was still ridiculously trapped there with the Dogman, even though the train was gone and completely out of my view, in my past. Furiously and impatiently, I just decided to ram the crossing. I would try to drive directly through the thing. I forced that gas pedal down through the floor of my car, and we sped off like Burt Reynolds in a bad 70s picture. Me and the Dogman who was hitching a ride, that is. We hit that railroad crossing bar at such a speed that it made us sound like someone just hit a 500-foot home run. I could feel that Dogman still on the rear of my car, weighing me down in the rear right. I decided to try to hit the next barrier at a slight angle in the hopes that he might bear a greater brunt of impact than he had with the first one. Driving over the tracks at that speed was insane, and we rocked and bounced madly. Whack! The second barrier was struck, sounding like a crack of thunder. The striped wooden bar split into several pieces, one of which seemed to take out the Dogman, or at least knock him loose from the rear of my vehicle. I never saw him in my rear view, but I could feel that he was no longer clinging to the vehicle. We were no longer weighed down. I could tell that I was finally free from the Dogman at the railroad crossing. Dogman stole my cell phone. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I once tried to walk across a natural area toward a shopping mall when I was out in the country house watching. I didn't have access to a car, and I didn't want to pay for a car service, so I just looked at a map and decided to cut through a patch of woods and get to the store that way. I hadn't counted on how hot a day it was, and I hadn't counted on there being hills and valleys in those woods. I also hadn't counted on how tiring the entire expedition was going to be. When I got to the store and I loaded up on what I needed to buy, I was miserable about the idea of heading back through those same woods, now loaded down with heavy stuff and with the sun starting to go down. I think I would have sprung for the car service if I had known in advance that Dogman was inside those woods, waiting for me. At first, I thought it was just a dog, a really big dog like a Marmaduke kind. It was acting friendly, but it was just so large. I found its attention a bit unnerving. It was following along, mostly behind me, sometimes sticking its nose up my butt and goosing me. My cell phone fell out of my pocket, and the dog raced over to grab it. It picked it up in its jaws and its teeth. I approached slowly, trying to calm the dog down, when it did something I never would have expected. It reared back and stood up on its hind legs. Now, I was looking straight up into the air to see my cell phone dangling from the teeth of a dog far taller than I was. I backed up a few steps and realized I was hyperventilating. I was panicking. I focused on breathing as I began to feel lightheaded and nauseous. I grabbed some yo-yos or ha-has out of the bag, some kind of a cake treat, and I held it where the Dogman could see or smell it. I got him to look at the cake, then I tossed it toward him, hoping he'd take the cake treat and give me back my cell phone. That Dogman looked at that cake treat, then, without moving his head, he sort of looked at me sideways with his eyes, and then the next thing I knew, he bolted. He just bolted off and he was gone with my cell phone still in his mouth. I guess he figured out that it was worth more than a supermarket cream-filled cake treat. I stood there feeling like the dumbest thing on earth. Even Dogman was smarter than I was. And that is the story of the time that Dogman stole my cell phone.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Dogman peeked in my bathroom. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a true story about a dog-headed man sighting. I don't know if it was a dogman or a werewolf, but it was a man-sized creature that was walking like a man, yet it had a dog's head. Not only that, it was a nosy character as well. The story began after my wife had new windows installed in the house, including in the bathrooms. Our upstairs bathroom only has a shower in it, but our downstairs bathroom has an antique bathtub, and I sometimes on the weekend like to luxuriate in it. Since the windows had just been put in, I didn't realize that the new curtains on them allowed far more to be seen from outside than what had been visible previously. As I was taking my bath, I looked up and screamed. Peering in through my window were the wild-looking canine eyes of an upright walking monster. It glared at me like it hated my guts. I grabbed a towel and ran from the bathroom screaming to my wife that there was a monster outside. She, of course, laughed at me and went into the bathroom to see what I was talking about. I expected to hear her screaming twice as loudly as I had, but apparently by then the Dogman had moved on. She put better, thicker, darker curtains on the windows that blocked the view in both directions, and I went back to finish my bath. It wasn't quite as enjoyable any longer, though, because now I was wondering the entire time if Dogman was on the other side of that wall. Checker Phil sent in a photo of himself and Bigfoot, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, our old friend B. Moss has come up with an all-new photo which she claims is of the Dogman. She sent me a copy which I'm showing you here. If you would like to hear B. Moss telling her story of how she came to take this photo, then check out the YouTube show called Mysterious Huntsman, and specifically look for episode number 37. Now, our other new cryptid photo of the day was sent in by friend of the show, Checker Phil, of the Checkerboard Kids television program in New York City. Checker Phil was at the Toy Fair this past weekend, where he also posed with this talking orangutan who was claiming to be me.
And no talking orangutan.
If you ask me, that might actually be a man in a costume, but that would just be my opinion. Thank you, Checker Phil, for that report from New York City. Before we get started with our first scary Dogman story, I'd like to thank one of the nicest people on the planet, aka today's executive producer, Catherine Heroy. Thank you, Catherine. You make doing what we do possible, and we're extremely grateful to you. If you'd like to become a Scary Stories executive producer like Catherine, just join our very affordable paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Within 24 hours of joining, you also get access to over 7 hours of scary, uncensored Dogman stories far too extreme for us to ever tell on this channel. And now, just for fun, let's try a psychic experiment. We can either start with our urban Dogman story, or our wilderness Dogman story, or else we can start off with our story of Dogman on a rich country estate. Choose which you would like us to start with and concentrate on that title. Go ahead, focus on the one you want, and let's see what happens. Urban Dogman, is that the title you chose? If so, you might have psychic powers. If not, don't worry, we'll try this again later in the show and maybe you'll do better then. Now, it's time to stop operating heavy machinery, dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare to be scared, because we're about to tell you our first tale, which we call Savage Dumpster Diving Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am writing to submit a story to you that happened to me in the alley next to my apartment in a suburb of Philadelphia that I don't want to name. I rented an apartment in a private home, and we had an area in the back where people would park their cars and store their garbage cans until the days when the trash was collected. A person in the building next door, who had lived there since before I was born, had passed away, and the guy seemed to have been a pack rat. The family came and was going through his belongings, deciding what to keep, what to sell, and what to toss out. For the most part, almost everything ended up in the third category, so they eventually went ahead and got a big old green dumpster, parked it outside in the back of the place, and started literally tossing stuff out the windows and into that big green bin. It was dangerous to walk past there during the day that week, and the air quality in the neighborhood also got dusty and uncomfortable while they were cleaning the place out. About the only good thing I can say about the process is that the entire family were Jeopardy fanatics, and so they would stop work at 7 p.m. sharp to watch Jeopardy, then go home immediately afterward. It was so loud all day, with random crashes as they threw TV sets and broken pottery and glass items out into the big metal dumpster. My nerves would be rattled by nighttime each day, and it was such a relief to finally have quiet by nightfall. So, one night, toward the end of the week, when it all seemed to finally be winding down, you can imagine how surprised and unhappy I became to be awakened after 3 o'clock in the morning by intensely loud noise going on in the garbage dumpster outside. My nerves had really been on edge for days, and this new disturbance, just when I thought I could begin to live a normal life again, served as the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. I got out of bed and grabbed my baseball bat, then started to walk out of the room. Deciding that swinging a bat in my hands would be sending the wrong message to the relatives of my deceased neighbor, I leaned it against the wall, threw my jacket on over my pajamas, and headed downstairs to the alley. I would be firm, but not rude, I told myself. It's all right to show frustration and annoyance, but it's never all right to show disrespect, my mother's internalized voice reminded me. By the time I reached the building's back door, I felt mentally and emotionally prepared to speak to my neighbor about this problem. As I approached the bin, I could see why the person inside was banging all around. The top had fallen shut, and here I was being angry. The person in there was only making noise because they were trapped. I felt bad for getting so mad. As I reached the dumpster, I wondered why they didn't lift the cover up, since although it was a metal lid, it didn't appear to be all that heavy. Then I saw that 2 latches had fallen into place, and that locked it shut. I undid both and helped the captive inside lift the lid up. Guess what? It wasn't one of the deceased neighbor's relatives in there. It wasn't even a human being. It was this sort of Bigfoot-looking thing, except it had a head, like a really fed-up, angry wolf. It was not grateful at all that I had set it free. As far as this thing was concerned, I was associated with it being trapped in the dumpster, and the idea of it being trapped in that dumpster made that dog-headed thing really unhappy. I ran back to the back door of the house, practically feeling that thing grabbing me from behind the entire time. As I threw myself inside, I looked back and saw that the thing had jumped out of the dumpster, and it was actually standing up on its hind legs like a man. It was standing there like it had just won in Fight Club, and it was daring me for a rematch. I swear, it had that kind of look on its face like, you better keep running if you know what's good for you. That sort of thing. I locked the house door and ran upstairs, crying uncontrollably like a little girl. The landlord saw this and asked me if my girlfriend had just dumped me. He thought it was really funny, but I knew I was too shaken up to explain to him what had happened. If I tried to talk and my voice cracked, that would have led to even heartier laughter from the guy I was renting my apartment from. I tried to think of something smart to tell him, but that Dogman had turned me into a mess, and I just needed to be alone to recover. I'm sorry to all you macho guys out there. I was not a good example on that night. I could lie to you and tell you I scared off the Dogman with my ninja skills, and the landlord was so impressed that he reduced my rent. In fact, maybe I should have said that instead. Seriously though, we are a few miles from any large park or wilderness area. Where I live ranges from suburban to urban, with some small and medium-sized parks thrown in. None of the parks could sustain a predator or a large scavenger either, I wouldn't think. So maybe what happened was a fluke and would never happen again. All I know is, if I hear weird sounds coming from a garbage bin from now on, I'll just call the cops. I've learned my lesson about poking my nose in where it wasn't invited when I got schooled by the savage dumpster diving Dogman. You know, you couldn't pay me to go near a garbage dumpster, even if it wasn't making any noise at all. I'm too scared of the rats. It doesn't even make any sense either, since in the forest I catch and eat rats all the time. But those same rats in an urban setting? Ugh, just gives me the creeps. Anyway, it's time for our second test of your psychic powers. We have 2 scary Dogman stories left. One is about a dogman on an elite country estate, and the other is about a dogman out in the wilderness. Focus on which story you would like us to do next. Go ahead. Keep focusing. When one or the other achieves a certain threshold of psychic concentration, it will automatically be declared the winner. There you go. The country estate Dogman is next. Congratulations to those of you who made both choices correctly. Perhaps you will be the world's next Ingo Swan. I have a question that you don't hear very often on scary story shows. Have you ever felt really, truly in love? No? Neither had the guy who sent in this next story either. Never, that is, until he met a girl so pretty that she could be a model, and so rich that she could buy his entire family, and in fact the entire town he had grown up in. He thought he would stop at nothing to please this woman, who he saw as so perfect. But that all changed when the roadblock between the two of them had the head of a dog and the body of a man. That's what happens in this next allegedly true narrative that we call Dogman Broke Off Our Date. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was in my mid-20s, back in the late 1970s, I briefly got to date a rich girl who was way out of my league. Let's call her Shirley. My name is Bob, but she would call me Reginald, which was my middle name. She felt it sounded less common than Bob. I liked it because it made me feel like I was in Archie comics. She was basically Veronica. We had met together for some events and to see movies and so forth in town, and eventually she got me well trained enough, she hoped, for me to get a chance to go visit her family's estate and meet her parents and other relatives. She instructed me how to dress, how to speak, how to behave toward the servants. It was easier to learn Portuguese than to remember all the rules involved in being around her family. It was nerve-wracking, and I was certain they wouldn't like me, even if I did every single thing correctly. I really liked this girl, though, and it was the kind of thing I knew I might never get a second chance at. So I decided to try my best to impress that family, even while accepting beforehand that the Vegas odds were going to be against me on this one. I was actually wondering if I should even try, and while I was thinking about it, there was an old episode of Star Trek on in the background. Captain Kirk was giving one of his inspiring speeches. He said something like, "Risk? Gentlemen, risk is our business." And I knew I had to try. I couldn't let the captain down. So on that day, it was overcast, and there were occasional flashes of lightning on various horizons. It seemed as though it were raining every place on the planet, and the feeling of a bad omen hung in the air, thicker than the fog and the car exhaust, as I got caught in a big, long, slow traffic jam. By the time I got to my rich girlfriend's neighborhood, my mind was wandering, and I was back feeling nervous and unsure of myself. My first view of her home impressed me. It looked almost like stately Wayne Manor from the old Batman TV show, but twice as tall and built up on the side of a hill. I hadn't even realized yet that this was her home. The entire hill, basically. Once I did, I almost had a heart attack. I was wondering when I would get to her place. Then I realized I had been driving on it already for some time. The road wound round and round the hill, going on for over a mile before reaching the house, at least from what I could see. I was gazing up the mountainous hill to try to figure out how much longer I would be driving before I got there. And when I turned my eyes back to the road, I found myself hitting the brakes and screaming out loud in shock and surprise. There was the silhouette of a dark figure on the road in front of me, and it filled the entire road. I was not going to be able to drive around it, as to the left of me was the hill itself, reaching upward toward my girlfriend's family home. And to the right of me was a sheer drop straight back down to the bottom of the hill. I did manage to stop the car right at the toes of that silhouette, which, from up close, sure looked like a werewolf or a were-dog. What I mean to say is that it seemed to be a monster from the movies, covered in fur, with a mouth full of meat-eating teeth and fangs. It looked nothing like a man. Its body was shaped differently from a human's, even though it did stand up straight like one of us. It had a tail, and generally speaking, humans don't have those. No sooner had I arrested our forward momentum than I reversed my course back out onto a part of the road wide enough for me to make a U-turn in and beat it all the way back down the hill and off that property. I remember I found a candy store or something nearby that had a payphone in it, and I called her up. This was long before cell phones. I got through to my girlfriend, and I told her what happened, but she just got annoyed at me. "Oh, Reginald, really? Are you surprised that it isn't easy to get to a woman such as myself? It was probably just one of the many frat boys chasing me, wearing a monkey suit. I must say, Reginald, you're one of the easiest to scare off ever. You're going to have to try a lot harder if you want a girlfriend of my caliber." On and on she lectured me. I think she was still lecturing me when I hung up. Was I a man or a mouse? If I wanted this girl, I was going to have to be a man. I resolved to be prepared to drive through that creepy frat boy dressed as a dogman if need be. Nothing was going to come between me and Shirley. I navigated the easier, lower part of the hill much faster than I had the first time, since I was now familiar with the twists and turns both backward and forward. It didn't really surprise me that the dogman was there, waiting for me, right at the exact same spot. This time, I was going too fast to be able to stop in time. At that speed, it was going to be all I could do to just keep the car on the narrow, winding hillside road. I saw the dogman realize that I would not stop in time. His eyes did not look upset or frightened by this. They looked pleased. As I was about to crash into the monster costume man, he leaped effortlessly and gracefully onto the hood of the car, sticking his face in my way and preventing me from being able to see the road in front of me. I knew we were about to drive right off the side of that hill, and I slammed on the brakes. I remember looking out my side window, trying to judge the edge of the cliff by how far I was from the hillside wall to my left. When I would look forward, I would see the face of this monster thing staring at me, salivating, wetness oozing out of its dog-like nostrils. And I understood that this was no frat boy in a rented costume competing for the affections of our Princess Shirley. No, this was some kind of actual wild animal that was trying to get us both to drive off the side of the road. The car had stopped moving, and I began driving backward once again, looking behind and out the window to my left to gauge my distance to the dangerous edge of the cliff. I was weeping, and I was shaking all over. I didn't even notice at what point the dogman had jumped off the hood, but he was gone by the time I reached the bottom, and I was in such a state of shock, I honestly probably wouldn't have been capable of noticing or caring just then anyway. I was not man enough to make it up to Shirley's house. I have no idea what that dog-headed thing was. Maybe it was an exotic monster that Shirley's dad let loose on the hill, to scare young men away from his daughter. Maybe it was just there randomly and the family knew nothing about it. All I know is that Dogman was a dead-end sign to me and to my relationship with that girl. And that's why I'm one of the few people alive who can honestly say, Dogman broke off our date. Dogman made me hold it in. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a short, down and dirty Dogman story for you. I was camping by myself in a clearing in the woods in the Adirondack State Park in New York. This is way, way upstate. The woods there are much closer to Montreal, Canada, than they are to New York City. In the middle of the night, I got up to relieve myself, and as I climbed out of my tent, I saw the most incredible thing. There, sitting alone in the middle of the field, was the biggest dog I had ever seen. It was tall and wide and black, and it had pointy ears up on top of its head with a curious expression on its long face. I'm not generally afraid of dogs, but this one gave me pause. It was just weird, the way it was sitting there, facing my tent. Also, it was just so large that it would be hard not to feel a little threatened out there alone next to it. I was like, good doggy, nice doggy, as I tried to sort of crab walk over to the bushes to do my business. The big dog didn't like that idea, and it began this sort of whining sound that graduated into a kind of intermittent growl. It bared its teeth at me, and I made a fast move back toward my tent. Making a fast move was a bad idea, as that Dogman sort of leaned forward, then reared back. It rose up in the air to an absurd height and looked down at me, barking furiously. I was sweating all over as I backed up as slowly as I could until I was back in my tent. I mean, big drops of sweat were just flying off of me, even after I was back in there. I never had to go so bad before, but there was no way I was going to risk another face-to-face with that big, dark, bipedal monster out there. By the time dawn came, I was finally able to run and finish what I had started hours earlier. It was an excruciating and uncomfortable experience in so many ways. And afterward, I swore off camping for almost a year and a half. I love being out in nature though, so eventually I returned to it, although I prepare differently now than I used to. Since that event, I bring an empty, old, lightweight plastic jar with me whenever I camp. You never know when you'll need it. And that is a lesson I learned on the painful night when Dogman made me hold it in. This episode is executive produced by Stell C. Thank you, Stell, especially in these very uncertain times on YouTube. We really are depending on the generous contributions we receive from nice folks like you. To become a Scary Stories executive producer yourself, just join our handy-dandy choose-your-own-price paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Now, let's get to the scary Dogman stories, all suggested by emails of alleged witness encounters sent to us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or called into us at our hotline number 804-LSCARY. This first one is about one of those nights that start off nice, but then before you know it, a Dogman arrives uninvited. In fact, we call this first one Ambushed in the Woods by the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you about encountering a Dogman when I was in a somewhat embarrassing state. It was probably the single most surprising and frightening thing that ever happened to me. Even though the entire encounter lasted a very short while, I still think about it all the time. It's hard to get it out of your mind when you've been ambushed by the Dogman. When I was a young man, I attended college in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, which is sort of in the center of the state. Although it's pretty civilized there, it's only a 20-minute drive away from some very wild, protected areas. I think there are all sorts of strange creatures possibly living in those woods, and I think I saw one of them. But I wasn't alone when I saw it. I was with a girl, a very strange and unique kind of girl. She was the kind of girl who wore sunglasses indoors, smoked cigarettes at the end of a cigarette holder, and would refresh her lipstick before every class. She seemed to think her legs were her best feature, as she showed them off in shiny high black heels and short skirts. She wore different elaborate hosiery every day, and I admit, I'd be curious each morning to see what she'd show up in that day. This girl was known to never smile, and all the guys I knew were too intimidated by her to try to even talk to her. I noticed she was always walking around alone, and I wondered if she might actually want a friend. I would look at her in confusion, trying to understand what kind of a person she really was, and who was there under the makeup and the outfits. I had never met anyone like her where I grew up. Back in the 70s, girls in my part of town wore baggy clothes to try not to draw attention to themselves, and shoes they could run in case attention got drawn to them anyway. It's not as bad there now, but that's the way it was in those days. So I decided to find out what a glamorous college chick is actually like, or at least what her name was. It turned out she had a really dramatic name, taken from Greek mythology, so let's call her Hera for the sake of this story. The actual name wasn't her real name anyway, and it was really long, and I could never pronounce it correctly. Hera was dramatic in everything she did, but when I would burst out laughing at her ridiculousness, she would collapse into laughter and join me. She seemed to take everything absurdly seriously, then laugh at how serious she was taking everything, and she didn't seem to feel there was any contradiction between these contradictions. We got to be known as a couple around campus before we actually were, and we got to be known as a serious item, which I'm not certain we ever actually became. I always remained at least a little afraid of her. I was never 100% sure she wasn't just crazy, and I also never got over the feeling that she was way out of my league. It seemed to matter a whole lot to my hormones that I please her and not get rejected by her. It's a terrible thing when your glandular system falls in love with somebody. They can tend to get very dictatorial about your prioritizing. Hera liked to be alone with her guys in the woods outside of campus. She would take them up toward a little mountain. Usually you could find a place to park near Old Furnace, then walk into the woods from there, scouting locations along the way. That was just her thing, don't ask me. Expensive clothes, hair, makeup, designer shoes. Then she wanted to sit on the grass in the dirt. Her hosiery alone looked like it cost more than my entire wardrobe. I found it very intimidating being alone with her, but I tried never to let her see that. I felt like she was slumming with me, but I tried to suppress those feelings as deep as I could shove them way down. So, one night, I was the boy with her out in the woods, on some grass between some trees with bugs all around us, and romance in her mind. We were doing what the college kids did, at least in those days, but on that particular night we were interrupted mid-party by something straight out of a drive-in double-feature horror movie. Now, when I say that this looked like a monster from the movies, as in the kinds of movies they made way back then, I mean it. This looked like a guy in a costume. It was absurd to see. It had a man-like body, but covered in dark black fur like a monkey. And then it had a dog's head up on top. It was like they couldn't afford to buy all of the gorilla costume, so they finished it off with a dog mask. I didn't laugh when I saw it, though, because of a few different things. First of all, whoever was going to run through the woods wearing a big old monkey costume with a dog mask was either someone insane or someone being hazed, and it wasn't hazing season. Second of all, she and I were in various states of undress, so we weren't that eager to be talking to anyone at all, other than each other. I stood up, pulling my jeans on in the same movement, snarling and looking as mean as I could. I cursed at the guy and told him to get away from us. I realized I was holding one of her high heels like it was a weapon. Maybe I was thinking I would poke his eye out or something, I don't know. The guy in the dog-headed gorilla suit dropped to all fours and howled to the sky. It was remarkably loud, and we both had to cover our ears. That wasn't the howl of a normal person. He had to be completely insane. His arms looked more like the front legs of a dog when he was in that posture, and I found that the more I saw of this guy, the less sense I was able to make out of what I was seeing. How could a human body get into that position? Why did his hands look so much more like paws? As I watched, the guy stood back up on his hind legs, and I noticed how odd they looked as well. The legs, I mean. They were bent like the back legs of a horse, only with claws at the end, not hooves. I was trying to imagine how he fit his legs into that costume when the head of the costume began barking at me and Hera fiercely. "Run, you idiot!" shouted the girl, who grabbed her shoe back from me and took off into the woods. Before I could take a breath or think a thought, that dog-headed guy in the costume took off after her, moving away faster than any guy in a costume could possibly move. I stood there, slowly putting my clothes back on and thinking. If you ask me, that guy in the dog-headed costume wasn't a guy in a costume at all. If you ask me, what we saw was a way, way early sighting of the one and only Pennsylvania Dogman. I saw Hera around campus, but we never discussed what happened, and we didn't date anymore after that either. She kind of got more serious then, and I think she transferred to a different college by the next semester. I don't know why we didn't want to see each other anymore after the Dogman chased her that night, but we just didn't. It was a very mutual decision, I'll say that much. Nothing was ever the same again after we got ambushed in the woods by the Dogman. Don't go anywhere. We've got 2 more Dogman stories coming up right after this message from PQ O'Ribber.
You know what time is coming soon, don't you? The day of the wearing of the green skin. I'm inviting you to me St. Patrick's Day Dogman Party. The one and only Dr. Death St. Patrick's Day Scary Story Special. An extra long episode, and only us ghouls and ghosts and deceased individuals are invited. Oh, all right. You seem cool. You can come too. It all happens here on the Scary Stories NYC channel, Tuesday, March 17th. Feel free to arrive early. All my other guests are late.
The Werewolf of West Milford. Dear Scary Stories NYC, back when I was in college, I had a girlfriend with a weird sense of humor. One time, one of her jokes led to us having a truly horrifying, up-close encounter with a real-life New Jersey Dogman. Near where I grew up, there is a road called Clinton Road, which is the most haunted road in all of New Jersey. This 2-lane blacktop surrounded by forest, has all sorts of weird legends associated with it. There's Dead Man's Curve, which is supposed to have the spirit of a boy living underneath it. There are other kinds of hauntings associated with Clinton Road as well, including green, glowing UFO lights, and even all white albino monsters that are said to live in the woods surrounding the road. In some stories, the albinos are said to be human. In other stories, they aren't albinos at all, but mutated animals which used to live at Jungle Habitat. That was a legendary park where suburban people would pay to drive their cars through areas with hungry wild animals in them. Sounds like the plotline for a horror movie, right? Well, eventually Jungle Habitat closed down, and all sorts of legends exist about what happened to the animals. Some of them supposedly interbred with the local creatures, forming all new science fiction style monsters. And as crazy as it may sound, that might actually explain the incredibly strange thing that I saw on Clinton Road in West Milford, New Jersey, with my own 2 eyes. So, when I was in college, I didn't have a car or a driver's license. I had the next best thing, though, a girlfriend with both. The trouble was that my girlfriend was more than a little bit weird. She had a morbid sense of humor and was kind of almost like a real-life Wednesday Addams. But, blonde and hot. I guess the only way she was actually like Wednesday Addams was her sick sense of humor, and that was what set everything in motion that night. She drove us both in her car to Clinton Road, then found a spot to pull off where we had a view of Dead Man's Curve. That's where the ghost of a dead boy is supposed to talk to you. If you throw a coin in the water there, he's supposed to throw it back, at least according to legend. After we pulled over, Blonde Wednesday started telling me where we were, as though I didn't already know. She pointed to the woods and told me that mutated albino creatures live in those woods, half human and half jungle habitat. It sounds kind of funny to repeat, but in the dark parked alongside Clinton Road in West Milford, in view of Dead Man's Curve, she was actually kind of freaking me out. I tried to make a joke out of it, but she had succeeded in frightening me. She started to make out, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't in the mood. Maybe it was all the stories I had heard about that road, but being parked there with the engine off made me feel helpless. I tried to talk her into turning the engine back on at least, so we could make a fast escape if a mutant monster freak jumped out of the forest at us. She was just laughing at what a chicken I was, but in truth, she was kind of braver than any of us boys. I mean, in a crazy way. She could take a positive quality like bravery too far and turn it into something bad. I was having my neck bitten by a giggling young woman when I saw something strange in the forest alongside the road. I couldn't really be certain of what it was, but there seemed to be someone or something there, moving leaves around. It had to be at least as tall as a young adult deer, possibly taller. I wondered if my girlfriend had a friend or two out in that forest, wearing albino mutant costumes or something. I could see that whatever or whomever it was, they were about to exit the foliage, and I should have a chance to finally see who or what they were. "Aha," I said inside the car. "Looks like it's time for your friend to arrive." "Friend?" she asked, looking around curiously. Her eyes caught the moving tree leaves and branches, and we both watched as something taller than me walked bipedally out of the bushes. As I expected, it was a person in a monster costume. I mean, it must have been because it was standing upright, and it clearly wasn't a bear. The only other option would be a man in a costume as far as I was concerned that night. So I did not scream, since I was expecting her to pull a trick like this in some way. The thing is, my hands and my entire body, they were shaking all over uncontrollably, in spite of the fact that I knew it was just a practical joke. There were some very unsettling aspects to this hoax I was viewing, things that made it nonsensical. For one thing, the boogeyman in question was no albino. It was dark-colored from top to bottom, and the only thing lightly colored about it were its two glowing, yellowish-white eyes. It didn't seem to be a mutant human to me. Maybe a mutant dog? It had a dog-like head, but it walked upright like a man would. I wouldn't think of it as a mutant, at least not a mutant like in the 1950s monster movies. It wasn't misshapen or anything. It was quite beautiful, actually, like a furry man who had been born with a wolf head. If that was a costume, it was a remarkable one, a stunning one. If that was faked somehow, I hope the creator or creators got to have high-paying careers in show business afterward, because they are or were supremely talented. But to be honest, I don't think it was a costume or a puppet or a trick of any kind. I think it was a genuine Dogman. And you want to know why? Because Wednesday Addams herself started that engine up and peeled out of there before the Dogman had a chance to get anywhere close to the car. I don't think it was a trick she was playing on me. I think it was a real, genuine, cryptid encounter along Clinton Road. I looked it up, and I am not the first to report seeing eyeshine and a possible werewolf or dogman along Clinton Road in New Jersey. I'm just the first who got tricked by a crazy girlfriend into seeing the werewolf of West Milford, Bungalow Bill, the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I spent my entire life in the city. I worked on the top floor of one skyscraper and lived on the top floor of another skyscraper, albeit slightly less tall than the one I worked in. All the time I spent way up in the air, I dreamed about retiring to some place in the country where I could remember what grass and dirt felt and smelled like again. I had decided that I was alienated from real life because I lived so far above it for so many decades. So, when it came time for me to finally pack in my working career and move forward, I decided to go ahead and bring my long-time dream to life. I got a small 2-story home in the outskirts of the suburbs. There wasn't anyone else for about a half a mile, but I was a 10-minute drive from a big shopping center with gas and auto repair, so it's not like I was about to be roughing it. Or so I thought. My very first night after moving in, I stood out behind the house just to have a chance to have my feet on actual ground and get to breathe the kind of air that humans were designed to breathe. And as I enjoyed the clean air, I heard it for the first time. There was a howling somewhere nearby. It sounded loud and low and sad, and it sent chills through me. I made mental note of how inappropriately exaggerated that reaction was. I mean, it was probably just someone's dog howling. I couldn't understand why I had such an instant and severe reaction to that howl. It took 2 more nights of savage howling, preventing me from having restful sleep, before I saw what was making that horrible, mournful racket. I woke up sometime after 3 a.m. to the extremely loud sound of that dog howling. I threw myself out of bed and ran down the stairs to see what this thing looked like. I was angry. I was tired. But I was also excited to get to put a stop to the howling, or at least identify the animal. If I could find out who owned him, then I could really get something done. As I reached the ground floor in my new home, the ground floor that I had been dreaming about for over 30 years while I lived and worked in high-rises, I looked quickly back and forth through the windows to the grounds outside. I had set up night lights around my property. I wanted to be able to see if a burglar were out there, but not create light pollution for my neighbors, so the lights were strategically placed and allowed me to circle around the house, certain that I was seeing no dog outside. Until I reached the back of the house and looked out the kitchen window. There, I saw the most incredible thing that nature could possibly have ever chosen to show me. I saw what looked like a giant wolf. It was like a linebacker for the Rams in a wolf costume, but the posture, how it sat on its haunches, and how it howled, it seemed genuinely canine. I stopped whatever I was thinking about doing, and I just stared at the sheer size of the thing. This dog was prehistoric. This wolf was Jurassic. My mind was blown, and so was all my courage. When I saw that thing, I was like, oops, I'll be quiet now. I was just thinking about how I should get back upstairs as silently as I could when that big wolf turned toward the window I was looking out of, and the two of us made eye contact. It tilted its head to the side in this really cute way, like a pet puppy would do. I swear it was adorable. It made that cute face for about 1/8 of a second, and then it basically erupted into savagery and hatred and started barking so loud it was screaming. It was showing all of its incredibly long teeth, and it was standing on its hind legs. And then it started running toward my kitchen. It started running toward me in the way an angry man would, not in the way a wolf might. This was not an animal sighting. It was more like an encounter with a Jungian archetype, or the essence of savagery and barbarism itself. I ran upstairs, and a while later realized I was hiding in the back of an upstairs broom closet, huddled in a fetal position, wet with my own tears. I was too scared to move, until I could see that it was morning. After that, I tried to act normal. Obviously, I hadn't seen someone's pet, so I had no need to go around asking neighbors if they knew who the wolf belonged to. It was some kind of a monster. A local monster, that's what it was. I had to be careful after dark, but I usually was anyway. I talked myself into not letting it be such a big deal to me. Okay, so I have a werewolf, so what? I even gave him a funny name so I wouldn't be so frightened of him. I was living in a bungalow, so I called him Bungalow Bill the Dogman. It helped me to feel less scared. In the days and weeks that ensued, I found myself feeling vulnerable in the house. When I was downstairs, I felt like I was down on the same level where all savagery takes place, where animals eat other animals trying to survive. It felt like there was no separation there between me and that it could break in on me at any moment. Similarly, up on the second floor, I didn't feel any better or safer. The second floor, after all, is like a ringside seat to the first floor, and the first floor is the floor of savagery, where all the animals live, the base and violent creatures of the earth who eat each other to survive. I wished I could be somewhere else, somewhere higher than the second floor, but that would have meant going out on the roof, and I'm certain I'd have felt even less safe and even more exposed out there on those tilted shingles. It seemed kind of inevitable that I would need to move back into the city. I no longer can afford to live on the top floor, but I'm still way up in the sky, far above you, and waving as you walk by down below. Walk by way, way down below. They're on the same savage level that all animal behavior takes place on. Down on the same level as Bungalow Bill, the Dogman. I'm happy to announce that today's episode is executive produced by Michael A. Bell. Thanks, Michael. We literally couldn't do the show without your contributions. If you'd like to become a Scary Stories executive producer like Michael, just join our handy-dandy paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. I'd like to start out with this tale of legend tripping gone wrong. Like the others, it was emailed to us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com. But unlike the others, we call this one the Sleepy Hollow Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I come from upstate New York, and when I was younger, I used to like to go legend tripping with a small bunch of my friends. One time we spent an evening messing around the cemeteries in the real town of Sleepy Hollow that all the movies and stories are based on. We hoped to see the Headless Horseman or Rip Van Winkle, but instead we had our fun night cut short in a hurry by an unanticipated visit from the Dogman. So here is where Washington Irving is buried. He wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, set in the cemetery of the old Dutch Reformed Church. That is not here. This is Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. The story was set in the much older cemetery here. The Headless Horseman chased Ichabod through the cemetery. Then they raced past the church, which still stands to this day. When they got past the church, they reached the covered bridge, where our poor Ichabod met his legendary doom. So, where is that bridge? Well, it's a sidewalk now. Google Maps marks the spot, but I'm not even sure there are any real-life markers over there. It's just a sidewalk with a concrete fence, and if you look past that railing, you can see what's left of the Pocantico River, possibly pronounced Pocantico. I'm not sure. Okay, so my friends could go to extremes sometimes to relieve their boredom. This was one of those times. When we hadn't had anything scary happen while walking down Broadway past those creepy old and older cemeteries. Then when we found out that the covered bridge at the end of our journey had been paved over into a boring sidewalk with a bench, my friends flipped out, and they decided we should go down off the bridge and investigate the dark river down there. Past the concrete railing along the edge of the sidewalk that used to be the Headless Horseman's bridge, you can see the river flowing down there. It's mostly been diverted underground due to all the roads and buildings in modern Tarrytown, but alongside the river to the right, there's another final patch of tombstones. Then, right next to the tombstones are private homes that are obviously currently lived in. So it's a little unclear what is town land, what is private land, what is historically preserved, what is modern. One thing I felt fairly certain about, though, is that in no way was it kosher for us to be climbing down that railing and jumping around down there between the river and the tombstones in the dark. My friends started calling out for Ichabod, and I pointed out how close we were to the houses. Then they whispered to Ichabod instead. We had wandered into a patch of trees, and I was 90% certain we were probably in somebody's backyard. I suggested we beat it out of there before one of the homeowners fired musket balls at us. Someone pointed out that we weren't actually back in time. We were just visiting Sleepy Hollow. It was like that. We were goofing off, messing around, not taking things very seriously. We didn't think anyone would mind, but then the Dogman showed up to express his disagreement with our assessment. I mean, it was just like that. We were in the dark, in the trees. One of us stepped in the river by accident, and we were all laughing at her, and then bark, 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 bark. The loudest dog barking I had ever heard, and we were all scared and screaming and looking around to see where this dog that was barking at us was. I figured that was proof that we had wandered into someone's backyard, that their guard dog was doing his job. That's when these two trees parted, and I mean someone or something parted these two adult trees. Then that someone or something presented his or herself to me and my group. We had no idea what we were looking at. I know this for a fact because we've had years and years to talk it over. We've each picked each other's brains more than once, as none of us really can understand what we went through that night. I don't want to make light of what happened next, as it was not a joke. nor was it funny to live through. None of us was physically injured, so in that sense the event was trivial. I'm not sure any of us could be truly said to be emotionally okay, though, after what we went through. We were young adults in our early prime, all our life ahead of us, nothing but fun and adventures to be had. We didn't care about trespassing in graveyards because we were from nice families, and nobody was going to arrest nice young people like us. Even if they did, we knew Daddy and Mommy would bail us out. Life was one big infotainment party for us. But we had cold water poured on us in our sleep by the Dogman showing up right when and where he did. It made no sense then, and it makes no sense now, but a hairy monster thing that had to have been almost 7 feet tall emerged from those parted trees, and he looked pretty unhappy with us for being there. This was not one of the little people. This was not the Headless Horseman. This was not Ichabod Crane. This was a monster. This was a legendary monster, a werewolf, or something closely resembling it. But no werewolf had ever been associated with Sleepy Hollow before. Why was there a dog-headed wolf man lurking in the river underneath the Headless Horseman's bridge? The Dogman's eyes widened when it got us into view, and I swear, it looked like they lit on fire with anger at the same time. His head was so freaking large, it started snapping at us like some sort of land shark. Imagine a velociraptor with fur. It raced back and forth between us, able to run circles around us and doing exactly that. It was trying to herd us into the water, where we would be most defenseless. One of the others shouted that we should all run in different directions, which I knew immediately was the wisest course of action for us to take. It wouldn't be able to hurt us all that way. I remember racing directly toward where we had parked the car back up near Washington Irving's burial place. It was selfish of me, I know, but the weirdest part is that I got there first. Everyone else had run off in less practical directions, but I suppose their actions were the only reasons that I had made it safely to the car. I didn't have the keys, though, so I stood there, looking around. Off in the distance, I could see a figure running toward me. He or she was coming through the tombstones and moving pretty quickly. It was hard to make out any features as the figure wasn't well lit, and I could mainly make them out in silhouette. I wasn't sure if I should hide behind the car or wave to them. I started to realize that if that was the dog-headed creature, I'd better start thinking of a plan B. I couldn't think of one, though, so I ducked down behind the car and hid myself as I watched that figure continue to get closer. Maybe I could climb under the car. If the creature tried to get at me, I could slide to the side furthest away from them and keep doing it while it circled around. I thought about climbing on top of the car, but it seemed that the Dogman would be able to do that more easily than I could. I kept looking around, trying to brainstorm Plan C and Plan D. I saw who was approaching. It was my friend whose car I was hiding behind. We both got inside and drove around looking for the others. I already gave you the spoiler that none of us were physically hurt that night, but I'm telling you, we were quiet and sullen on the way home that night. We had been taught lessons, and we had been schooled and all that sort of stuff. We had learned that not everything in life is just a joke to LOL at. I guess there is still a reason for respect and an importance to respect your surroundings and whatever lives you encounter wherever you go. We went into Tarrytown acting like it was the Sleepy Hollow amusement park, when it's an actual town with real living people there. We behaved childishly and selfishly, but we were made to understand that, in no uncertain terms, by the Sleepy Hollow Dogman. I think I'm becoming a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I recently broke up with a girl who told me that she put a werewolf curse on me. I laughed when she said it, but ever since then, all the people I know in my college keep talking about it. Some of them joke around, and some are deadly serious, but I have to hear several times a day that I'm cursed and I'm a werewolf. It might be power of suggestion, but I'm starting to seriously wonder if the curse is real. Could I possibly actually be becoming a werewolf? A once-a-month Dogman? My ex-girlfriend comes from a family with a long history of working in sorcery. I have run into one of her brothers who laughed at me and told me that soon my eyebrows would meet in the middle. He wasn't wrong, though. My eyebrows have indeed become furrier and more Eugene Levy-like ever since I dumped that creepy girl. You know, she and I would argue all the time. I don't even know why she wanted me to stay with her. She should have been glad I went away instead of cursing me for it. The first month after the curse, I already became really conscious of the phases of the moon. I couldn't tell if it was psychosomatic or if it was instinct reasserting itself, but I can literally feel the pull of the moon growing and lessening as it waxes and wanes. At least I think I can. It sure feels as though I can. On the full moon, I need to stay inside. I become irritable, paranoid, tense, stressed out. And I know you won't believe me, but my hair thickens up. I don't just mean on top of my head or on my face. I mean, I become more conscious of the hair covering my entire body. I feel like a beast around the full moon, and I just want to be left alone at home by myself. I need to shave 3 times a day. It gets crazy. Then, a few days later, things go back to relatively normal, you know? Again, I don't know if it's my imagination, but it sure does seem to get a little bit more severe every month. I can imagine in a year or two that I might even change it to something not too far different from what we might call a skinwalker or a werewolf. It makes me feel so sad and empty inside. I feel like my life is being cracked open and spilled out forever just because this girl was angry at me one day. And she wouldn't have been happy staying with me anyway, so it's just so pointless. Is there a way to undo what she has done to me? I don't want to hurt her or her family. I just want to stop their curse from working on me. Even if the condition could be arrested to stay as bad as it is now but not get worse, at least then I would know how to manage it. If it continues to progress, I'm very concerned it could become something that flies way out of my own personal control. And this is all because I think I'm becoming a werewolf. Dogman chased me through the vineyards. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had a terrifying experience last year when I was chased by a dog-headed caveman type thing through the wine country in Sonoma. Yes, I saw Dogman in California. I live basically almost inside a vineyard, although that ends when I go away to the East Coast to college in autumn 2020. This was 2019, though, when this happened. I was sent on an errand by my mother, and I was riding my bicycle through fields and fields of planted grapes. I needed to get through the vineyard to get to the street to perform the errand, but getting through that vineyard was 80% of the job itself. It was a 20-minute ride just to get to the street, where the drugstore was only 5 minutes further away. I enjoyed riding through the fields on most days. I had time to myself to either think or not think as the mood struck me. I didn't have to be ordered around, and I didn't have to act like I was happy with it either. There was nobody for as far as the eye could see, so sometimes I took to singing loudly or even shouting out foul language as though I had Tourette's syndrome. It was strenuous cycling, and if I didn't go quickly, I would face harsh criticism when I got back. so it wasn't like I had time to goof off. But still, out of all the things I was forced to do against my will, I found that the hour or so it might take to cycle to town and back were the least objectionable. I also liked buying things from my parents in the stores because the store owners would talk to me like I was a human being, not a slave. So, on this day, I set out into the field, and when I was about 7 or 8 minutes into the trip, I noticed this dust-like storm being kicked up to my right, way off in the fields. I took a few glances in that direction, but it really looked like the Tasmanian Devil from the Bugs Bunny cartoons was way over there running toward me. I actually stopped and looked at the thing for a while. Could it be a tornado? If so, it was a small one. It seemed more like something moving very fast through the dry dirt, raising dust behind it. Something like a motorcycle. But could a motorcycle drive that fast through a vineyard? I got a chill through me as I realized that whatever that was out there, it was the only other thing besides me within eyesight. And if I didn't get a move on, it was going to intercept me. I went from confusion to panic in 2 seconds. I suddenly had a very desperate need to get my fanny out of that vineyard and into the town. I cycled and cycled, and for the first time ever, my 10-speed bike felt really slow. Whatever was out there kicking up the dust seemed to be catching up to me, and I began to become unreasonably frightened. I wondered, if I got taken out right where I was, how long would it take for anyone to find the body? And when they told my mother, I imagined her main question would be if I got her prescription filled or not before the event of my passing. I was sweating, as much from the exercise as from the fear, and I was red-faced with embarrassment for some reason too. Maybe nervousness might be a better word. I used to blush when I would get picked on in school as a kid, and this was like that. I was blushing because I was deeply afraid that I was being chased. It was possible that dust storm out there was random, but I sure didn't think it would turn out to be. I kept up an effort to see the thing better. I would watch the road, then turn my head and squint, then return to watching the path, then repeat. I felt that each time I looked, I saw a slight bit better what was out there. But each time I came back with more information, I felt less certain that my eyes could be correct in what they were telling me. This was not someone on a motorcycle or other kind of motorized vehicle. This wasn't even anyone on a bicycle like me. This was an individual, out, running, and yet they appeared to be generating speed so far in excess of my own that they kicked up that dust storm behind them. I looked behind myself. The dust I was kicking up was barely visible. The figure got closer and closer, and I became increasingly certain that I must be a victim of ergot poisoning or some such thing. I was seeing something from a Benicio del Toro movie running out there. It was like a man, but it had this Del Toro dog head on top of its deformed Del Toro body. This was a Hollywood nightmare up in the wine country. Things like this are only supposed to happen south of here. I saw the Dogman racing faster than it should have been able to run, at least bipedally, and I saw the exit of the fields that would leave me in the little town area with the stores. Was I gonna get there first? Or was the Dogman? And if the Dogman got there first, what exactly was I gonna do? I was entirely alone there, and nobody else ever was on this dirt path. My parents took the car and went around the long way on the paved roads. I was the only one who rode a bike besides my sister and her boyfriend, who I saw entering the gate far in the distance. They would be coming down the path toward me. Now it would be 3 against that one Dogman. Would he still try to attack us? Would he alter his course in any way, shape, or form in reaction to the two of them showing up? I looked, but I saw no more Dogman. I saw his cloud of smoke from his trail, and it was dissipating up into the sky, being blown about by the wind. I looked on the land and could no longer see any sign of the creature. If he was hiding, where was he doing so? I could see for miles in 3 directions. Greeting my sister and her boyfriend in a warm manner, I convinced them to come to the store with me, thereby ensuring I would have company on the ride back. The Dogman wasn't there on the way back, and so far I haven't seen him again since that day. I know he's out there now, though. I know that if he was there that one day, he's probably still there today, and will likely still be there tomorrow or even 4 years from now, when I might possibly move back after college. That's sort of why I want to pursue a degree that leads to instant employment when I get out. No liberal arts degree for me. I want to go from school into the workforce. I want to go from the dorms into an apartment. I never want to move back to the wine country because Dogman chased me through the vineyards. We got a couple more stories to tell you. Well, someone does. Yeah, someone has some more stories to tell you, but they're bad luck Friday the 13th stories, and that's too creepy for us. Yeah, that's too creepy for me and him. So we're gonna split now, if that's okay, and leave you in the frail, aged hands of the old dude. Don't forget, PQ Ribber is back tomorrow with all new stories in our St. Patrick's Day Dogman special. Ciao all. See you then. Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm the old dude filling in for all the chickens who are too superstitious to host the Friday the 13th episode. Cowards. Not a real man among them. And so it falls to me, a senior citizen, to do the heavy lifting. Isn't that always the way? Before we begin today's extravaganza, I'd like to point out that 7 years of good luck are now due to today's executive producer, Itris Pardus. Thank you, Itris Pardus, for your contributions to our show. We couldn't do it without you. And we hope you use your 7 years of good luck wisely, bringing about world peace or improving the culture in some other way. Glory be to thee, O Itris Pardus, executive producer of the day. And if you too would like 7 years of good luck, you can be a Scary Stories executive producer as well by merely joining our very affordable paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. And now, to the first of our tales for today. This one has a moral at the end. Actually, they both do. Just like Saturday morning cartoons from the 1970s. So you won't want to miss those at the end. The more you know and all that rot. I want to warn you, before we get into it, this first story is pretty freaking scary. You might want to turn on all the lights and lock all your doors before we get started with it. But if so, you're gonna have to pause, because we're charging directly into our first story of the day, which is called Friday the 13th, Bad Luck, Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I never used to care about Friday the 13th until May 13th, 2016. That was the day I ignored my girlfriend's wish to stay home watching Jason Voorhees movies, and I went out for a drive that ended up with me almost losing my life to the Dogman. I live with my girl, let's call her Patricia, and she and I both work from home on our computers. We'd only been together around 7 or 8 months, and I don't think I knew yet that she had this weird thing about Friday the 13th. She didn't even know the date until it was after lunch, when she suddenly realized it was the bad luck day. She suddenly wanted to cancel the night out that we had planned. This annoyed me because we were supposed to hit my favorite rib joint, and I was really looking forward to it. If she wanted to cancel going dancing afterward, I was A-okay with that. But why would someone ever want to cancel a chance to eat barbecued ribs? It's just not something that would ever make any sense to do. Patricia hates horror movies, but she was so desperate to get me to stay in that night that she suggested we download and binge watch as many Jason Voorhees Friday the 13th movies as we could find. She even offered to pay if we couldn't find them free. I finally agreed to a compromise. If I could drive over to that rib joint and pick up dinner to go, I'd be glad to bring it home and share it with her while we watched horror flicks. That choice did not make her happy, but my mouth was already watering for those ribs, so she had to take what she could get. Soon, I was off, zooming through the woods toward the dinner of my dreams. And she was looking up movie titles on YouTube and whatever streaming services we had back then. My spirits were really high after I accomplished my mission and started to drive back through the woods with the ribs making my car smell good enough to eat. I felt like we were driving on air, and then suddenly, reality reminded me that it was, in fact, Friday the 13th. My back left tire blew a flat. It scared the bejeebus out of me and I almost skidded off the road. Calming both myself and the vehicle down, I managed to pull off the road to a spot where I could take the old tire off and put the spare one on. It was a dark night, and the only sounds I could hear were crickets and cicadas chirping, but they were loud, and I felt as though I were blanketed in them. My heart was still beating fast from the surprise of the blowout, which had really shaken me up more than I would have expected. An owl hooted in the woods, and it scared me so much that I accidentally slammed the door on my hand. I didn't break anything, but wow, that hurt, and I was seeing stars. It took a while before the pain in my hand subsided to a fierce throbbing, and I was able to get the trunk of the car open. It took a lot of concentration to change the tire because 3 fingers on my right hand were very painful to use. All of this was getting to me. I wasn't becoming impatient or angry as I might normally have done. Instead, I felt overwhelmed, and I wanted to cry. I just slowed everything down and did one thing at a time. One turn of the screw, wait for pain to subside. Another turn of the screw, wait for pain to subside again. I would get through this, and I would get home, and then Patricia would have a good long laugh at what she would call my Friday the 13th bad luck. I was finishing up my work when I first heard it. There were leaves rustling in the woods near me, and they were moving in a somewhat violent manner. It was instantly terrifying. I mean, there shouldn't be anyone in the trees off to the side of the highway at night. There just shouldn't be anyone there. I needed another couple of turns of this screw. Then I had to open the trunk, put my tools in there, close the trunk, get in the driver's seat, start the engine up, and go. That was all I had left to do. But I paused, and I peeked up over the car, looking toward the forest, where all that shaking and rustling was going on. Before I knew what was happening, this big, ape-like dog jumped out of the woods. Leaped out onto the grass. It was a very energetic entrance. He was like the Kool-Aid guy busting through the wall going, "Oh yeah!" I'm going to try my best to tell you exactly what I was looking at so that you hopefully will be able to understand why I did what I did next. Okay, imagine Lou Ferrigno with a whole lot of fur, right? Then imagine someone stuck a straw in there and started inflating each of his muscles to ridiculous sizes, like he had balloons attached to his skeleton all over. Just the most absurdly over-ripped monkey man ever, but with a dog head, even though he's standing up, not down on all fours. The body was tall but wide like a gorilla, yet the posture was not like a gorilla at all, in that It did not slouch. I honestly don't remember the legs. It's possible that the grass was tall that night. I don't have any visual memory of whether they were dog-like hind legs or gorilla legs or some other kind. I was mainly focused on the hairy chest and the long, terrible arms and claws the thing was showing off. It literally beat its chest like an alpha male gorilla. What kind of a dog would ever do something like that? Remember all the stuff I said I had to do? I had to finish screwing in one of the tire screws, and I had to put the tools back in the trunk, and etc., etc. Well, I realized I had forgotten to do any of that as I watched that Dogman running after me in my rearview mirror. He was gaining on me, even as I was speeding up from the 20s into the 30s. When I got closer to 50 miles an hour, I saw him beginning to fall back, and I sighed a breath of relief. A moment later, the creature began running after me on all fours and once again began to gain on me. If it ran faster on all fours, maybe the hind legs really were like those of a dog, I'm not sure. I honestly don't remember seeing them very clearly. I floored it the rest of the way home, and I'm very lucky I didn't get a ticket or end up in an accident. Patricia was gonna make fun of me, so I sat in the car and cried for a minute, just to try and get it out of my system before I went inside. I looked at myself, and it looked like I had been crying, so I opened the car window to breathe some air and compose myself before heading inside. A howl erupted from the woods nearby, and I bolted into the house. Patricia could see something was up, but it took her a while to get it all out of me. Instead of laughing at me, she made me hot cocoa and told me how happy she was that I got home safe. We tried to watch scary movies, but I was very jumpy and I kept looking out our windows. I was concerned that the thing had followed me home and that our troubles had only begun. I think we put on comedies instead, or even cartoons, just something to lighten the mood and make me feel a little more normal. The moral of the story to me is that you should never, ever laugh at your girlfriend's superstitions. Just assume she's right and that she knows what she's talking about. After all, she was smart enough to pick you, right? Fortunately for us, our streak of bad luck was over for that night, and never again were either of us visited by the Friday the 13th Bad Luck Dogman.
You know what time is coming soon, don't you? The day of the wearing of the green skin. I'm inviting you to me St. Patrick's Day Dogman Party. The one and only Dr. Death St. Patrick's Day Scary Story Special. An extra long episode, and only us ghouls and ghosts and deceased individuals are invited. Oh, all right. You seem cool. You can come too. It all happens here on the Scary Stories NYC channel, Tuesday, March 17th. Feel free to arrive early. All my other guests are late.
The Friday the 13th Dogman Haunting. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've always been afraid of the number 13, and my greatest fear of all is when Friday falls on the 13th of the month. It doesn't happen that often, but to me, it feels like it happens almost every month. I still have this superstition ruling my life even though I've been punished for believing in it. Punished by the great Friday the 13th Dogman haunting. This all happened back in 2015, a dire year for me personally. We had 3 Friday the 13ths that year, one in February, one in March, and again on November 13th. I flipped out all 3 times, but by November, I had already lost 3 friends due to the stress caused by taking Friday the 13th so seriously. On March 13th, 2015, I found myself locked into my own home, staring out the windows at a creature of myth and legend. It was one of those moments where you realize this might be the end. If that thing, that dog-headed werewolf thing, decides to come into this house, then that's the end of me for good. It was also one of those moments that seemed like you were inside a poem or at least a screenplay. The superstitions had hold of me like an addiction. The werewolf appeared as both a manifestation of and symbol for my inability to get away from childish superstitions. Even while I was looking out there at the monster, realizing how easily it could get in and how quickly it could dispatch me if it so decided, I still was making excuses for my irrational superstitious beliefs. I'm not superstitious, I told myself. I just see the world in the old school anima mundi sort of a way. I was of the belief, I told myself at the time, that there is no such thing as superstition, and in fact, the word itself was a biased term invented by atheist scientists to shame those of us who see the universe as living consciousness itself. All of my friends were out at a party that I had been invited to. They were angry at me for not going. I really couldn't call them to come rescue me from the Dogman. I thought about calling the police, but that idea was a non-starter as well. What do I mean when I say I was locked in my house by the Dogman? I mean, there was a hairy, prehistoric-looking, dog-headed creature that stood as often on 2 legs as on 4, encircling the house and making threatening sounds and movements toward me. It was larger than I am, and it was either a dark gray or a dark brown, possibly. It wasn't really bright enough in the parts of my yard he seemed content to race through, to be certain. And that's another aspect of the horror I was facing, the incredible speed of the thing. I felt as though I could have waited till it was by the back door, then run out my front door, and it still would have intercepted me before I got to my car. This large, impossible, and mythical, werewolf-like apex predator had taken an unhealthy level of interest in me, and I was trapped. I don't think I would have tried to make a run for my car, even if I thought I could make it. The idea of driving around on Friday the 13th was as painful a notion as the situation I was stuck in. My fear of Friday the 13th was worse than my fear of an actual man-eating predator stomping around outside my own home. Do you see now how severely controlled I was by the whole Friday the 13th thing? I would stop it if I could, but it seemed to be deeply ingrained in me. I suspect that in a former life, I may possibly have been a member of the Order of the Knights Templar. That may have seemed like a non sequitur just now when I suggested reincarnation and so forth. I was sort of joking, but also sort of serious. If you don't know, or even if you do, the Knights Templar were the knights who went on the Crusades to the Middle East. The Templars were also the Western world's first bankers, essentially, and they chose to use that money to finance a particularly stupid war started by King Philip IV of France. The king fell deep in debt, then realized, hey, he wouldn't have to pay his debts back if he got his bankers imprisoned and put to death. So, on Friday the 13th, in the year 1307, he accused the Knights Templar of heresy, of worshipping the devil, of conspiring with Satan against the church. Of course, this was all nonsense, and in 2007 the Vatican admitted as much, dropping all charges against the Templars for the sake of history. So, what does this have to do with my fear of Friday the 13th, you might ask? What are you afraid of, that the French king will have you imprisoned? Why are you so unreasonably afraid of a date on a calendar? Well, I can't answer you except to say that every Friday the 13th of my life, something bad always happened to me. I broke my leg one time. I got an F on a report another time. And the biggie was probably when my parents told me they were getting a divorce on Friday the 13th when I was 13. That seriously messed up my mind, so thanks a lot, Mom and Dad. If I hadn't been superstitious before that, I certainly would be afterward. I mean, they had to have known it was going to happen for some time, so Why choose a date with such an aura of doom about it to inform your only son that he would be losing his family and home life? It's like the result of planning by supervillains. I think that would almost be enough to turn Richard Dawkins superstitious, if you know what I mean. I was traumatized by the idea of bad luck, and I had a stress disorder related to the date, Friday the 13th, ever since then. So, when my girlfriend of that era, let's call her Sandy, when Sandy wanted me to go to a party with her on Friday the 13th in March 2015, I said no. And she was not very understanding about it either. Sandy had been friends with my friend Ben before I met her, and whenever she was angry at me, instead of talking to me directly about it, she would just slander me to Ben instead, and I would hear about it secondhand, that my girlfriend was angry again. This was no exception. I got a call in the morning from Ben begging me to go to the stupid Friday the 13th party that night with Sandy. I asked him the same thing I'll ask you. Who, in their right mind, throws a party to celebrate a day of bad luck, a day when great evil was performed on good men? It seems so shallow to me, and not something I would want to participate in, even if I weren't deathly afraid of Friday the 13th and the number 13 in general. You know the word triskaidekaphobia, right? The fear of the number 13? I've been called crazy for disliking this number, but a whole bunch of intellectuals are in the same club as I am. In fact, our 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, himself a Freemason, an order which descended from the Knights Templar allegedly, was triskaidekaphobic, same as I am. I don't see why all attitudes toward dates and numbers must be referred to as superstitions, simply because there is no scientific empirical evidence that such an attitude makes sense. The idea of celebrating bad luck, of sneering in the face of the fates, well, feel free to do so if you are so inclined, but I don't really like deliberately inviting trouble into my life. And yet, on March 13th, 2015, by avoiding the number 13, that is exactly what I did. I invited a whole heapin' helpin' of trouble into my life. In fact, it was by avoiding the Friday the 13th party that I ended up inviting the worst bad luck day of my entire life to come and happen. First of all, Sandy went to that party with Ben instead of me. She met a guy there named Dirkwad or something. He was this totally rich, complete jerk-ass with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Nevertheless, Sandy went home with Dirkwad. Then she dumped me, and she stayed with the Dirkwad. Then she married the Dirkwad. Then he passed away of some weird medical thing, and she was left a millionaire widow before she was 30. Sandy never spoke to me again. I'm nowhere near her social class anymore, and I never will be again either. Going to that Friday the 13th party was the luckiest thing that Sandy ever did. And because I stayed home, I lost her forever. I mean, really lost, like she won't even friend me back on Facebook. But that was hardly the worst thing that happened to me that Friday the 13th night. My friend Ben, who I'd been close with since kindergarten, laid into me the afternoon of that day that I was going to lose Sandy. Of course, he was right, and he was doing his best to warn me, but I felt that if Sandy didn't understand my need to stay home on Friday the 13th, then maybe she just wasn't the right girl for me. In retrospect, there is truth in that because she would have been wasting her time with me. Back then, I thought the idea was an expression of the notion that I was too good for her, but now I kind of see it the other way around. Ben and I are friends on Facebook these days, but we don't write on each other's pages, and I'm not sure if I have his current phone number or not, so a lot of things kind of ended for me on that Friday the 13th, more than I would understand until years had passed and I was able to look back on it with some perspective. I suppose those things were terrible for me, and they are punishments which last until today. At the time, though, I thought the worst thing that happened to me that night was my visit from the Dogman. I remember locking my door and locking all my windows and feeling a smug sense of satisfaction that I knew better than my friends, and that I was the one best prepared for Friday the 13th. I expected that on Saturday I'd hear their sad stories of how they wished they had been like me and stayed home where they would have been safe. I was so certain that I knew better than everybody else. Back then, I was renting the ground floor of a house on the outskirts of town. It was a bit of a drive to get there. It was relatively isolated and out by the woods, but it was cheap, and I had a lot of space and a backyard area I was free to use. My landlord lived upstairs but was gone 3 weeks out of the month, so I could usually blast music or TV loud, and we had a few pretty amazing parties out there when I first moved in. The backyard had hedges lining the side toward the driveway and garage, and trees lining the other sides. There was no fence per se. You could just sort of make out the natural boundaries. I don't know who owned the wooded areas surrounding us, but they were unused, and I would sometimes walk in them when I needed an emotional reboot. There were squirrels in there, owls, other smaller birds that I don't know the names of. I saw deer in there 3 different times. It was pretty magical for me since I had grown up in Detroit, and the only animals that roamed in my neighborhood back then were rats. As a city boy, I foolishly thought of the woods as all good, as though it weren't a wild place where wild things happened. I grew up scared of what might come out of the sewer, but I also grew up thinking that only Bambi lived in the forest. I would be taught otherwise by the Dogman. Have you ever seen an insane dog? Neither have I, but the creature outside my window that night looked like an insane dog head on top of some other kind of body. Maybe it was a giant sloth or something. Did they walk bipedally? This was not slow, though. This animal was really fast, and it had a bad attitude. Like it knew it was fast, and it knew I was slower, and it knew it was scaring me with the things it would do. It would be across the yard, then run screaming, with its face plastered flat on the glass, screeching at me wide-eyed. In the time it crossed the entire yard, I barely had time to take 1 or 2 steps back away from the window. No animal is that fast, not in real life. This was something that had stepped out of horror or fantasy. This was an impossible monster, and it had been sent to ruin my life and drive me insane. Silly monster. I was insane before it met me. I survived the night, obviously. The Dogman didn't get in at me or harm me in any way physically. He just taunted me and scared me. He celebrated my fear and lapped it up like it was something savory and sweet. He laughed at me and then left, and in his place, ever since then, life itself has been laughing at me instead. The moral of this story, if you ask me, is that you should never tell your kid that you're splitting up his family on Friday the 13th if you don't want to traumatize him for life and eventually cause him to have to live through the Friday the 13th Dogman haunting. Hey, it's me, Henry Lee Dogman, here to thank those of you who support all of us here at Scary Stories NYC. It really helps us if you click like and if you forward our videos or leave cool comments. If you can, it helps us even more when you let us share our 25 episode and growing collection of uncensored scary Dogman stories with you by becoming a paid subscriber at peterbernard.com. That's right, join our monthly club and get 25 stories right off the bat, each of them wilder than what we're allowed to tell you on this channel. Then, each Sunday, get another new scary story, usually a Dogman story, but always uncensored and secret, available nowhere else on the planet. Please consider joining us today at peterbernard.com and keep the scary stories coming. Thanks, everyone.
Come back for more scary story.